The narrative doesn't end with our inspection. The vault continues to accumulate entries as contemporary Rockefellers and their foundations respond to new challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and pandemics. Some great-great-grandchildren have become vocal proponents of renewable energy and supporters of movements seeking reparative justice for communities harmed by industrial pollution. Others maintain ties to finance and industry, believing that engagement within markets is the best way to drive change. They join boards of NGOs, seed startups focused on clean technology, or volunteer in local food banks. The debates that began with Devil Bill's hard bargaining and Eliza's moral instruction now take place within a 21st century context of globalization and digital communication. They ask, how do we use a fortune rooted in oil to build a sustainable future? How do we atone for our predecessors' mistakes while continuing to honor their philanthropy? These conversations show that the vault isn't just a relic, but an active space where values are renegotiated and where the next chapters of the story are being written. By understanding the complicated legacy inside that vault, we gain insight into our own choices and the ways in which wealth, power, and conscience can be woven together for better or worse. Rockefeller Center itself deserves a story within this story. Conceived during the depths of the Great Depression, the complex was initially planned as a new opera house for the Metropolitan Opera. When funding dried up, John D Rockefeller Jr. decided to finance a commercial and cultural center in partnership with a radio corporation. At a time when jobs were scarce, the project employed thousands and became a beacon of resilience. Art Deco towers rose from bedrock, murals were commissioned from artists across the world, and public plazas opened space for ice skating and gatherings. Though some critics dismissed it as a monument to vanity, millions came to see it as a symbol of New York's capacity to reinvent itself. It showed how private investment could create a public square, and how architecture could articulate hope amid hardship. David Rockefeller's international diplomacy blurred the line between private initiative and public policy. As chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, he cultivated friendships with political leaders around the globe, from Iran's Shah to China's Zhou Enlai. He opened branches in countries across 5 continents, advocating for open markets while navigating Cold War tensions. Supporters called him a citizen diplomat who used finance to foster dialogue. Detractors argued that he pursued bank interests even when regimes violated human rights. His lobbying to admit the deposed Shah of Iran to the United States in 1979 contributed to the crisis that led to the hostage standoff. Yet he also spearheaded the revival of New York's downtown, supported the arts, and championed urban planning. His legacy exemplifies the tightrope between influence and interference that wealthy individuals walk on the world stage. Within the family, debates over how to use wealth intensified as social values evolved. In the latter half of the 20th century, cousins joined the emerging movement of shareholder activism, pressing companies to disclose environmental risks and to adopt fair labor practices. Some advocated divestment from companies engaged in apartheid or pollution. Others argued for engagement and reform from within. Members of the 5th and 6th generations became filmmakers, organic farmers, psychologists, and social workers, reflecting a departure from the traditional domains of banking and industry. They held family meetings to discuss carbon footprints and gun safety, mental health and digital privacy. Even as their lives diverged, they continued to return to room 5600 or to the family homestead to reconcile their views and decide on joint philanthropic ventures. The disagreements remained largely private, illustrating their desire to manage conflicts quietly while acknowledging that inherited wealth brings complicated responsibilities. There are also the ordinary moments that humanize this clan. Letters reveal siblings teasing each other about chores, complaining about piano lessons or celebrating simple pleasures like a ride in the country. Abby Babs Rockefeller's correspondence shows her joy in gardening and her frustration when reporters called her shy. Nelson's diaries capture a man enthralled by abstract art one day and exasperated by legislative hearings the next. Lawrence wrote about the peace he found in the mountains, away from boardrooms. David confessed in his memoirs that he felt pangs of guilt about missing family dinners, but also immense satisfaction when his efforts spurred new development projects or saved endangered art. These glimpses remind us that behind the surname are individuals with personal passions and insecurities. Ultimately, the vault is not merely a storehouse of contracts and charitable deeds. It is a mirror reflecting larger currents in American and global history. Through the Rockefellers, we see the rise of industrial capitalism, the emergence of modern philanthropy, the intersection of science and politics, and the enduring tension between private wealth and public good. Their story also warns of the perils of concentrating power and the ease with which good intentions can slide into abuses. When we humanize them, we neither excuse nor condemn. We strive to understand. Their actions were shaped by the norms and knowledge of their times, some of which we now recognize as flawed. Future generations will likely judge us with similar ambivalence. Recognizing this helps us approach their legacy with humility and a willingness to learn. You know that feeling when you step down into a cool, quiet room and suddenly the bustle of the city above fades away? Imagine doing that in Manhattan, beneath the skyscrapers, and discovering a chamber filled with heavy vault doors and shelves lined with old ledgers. These aren't just dusty books. They're the accounts and letters that built one of the most powerful fortunes in modern history. In popular lore, people talk about a Rockefeller Vault, a secret place where the family's wealth and mysteries are stored. This vault is more than a safe. It symbolizes the contradictions and hidden stories of a dynasty that turned oil into influence and who saw generosity and ruthlessness intertwined. When we open that metaphorical vault, we don't just find gold. We find the family's struggles, their shrewd decisions, their acts of charity, and their mistakes. It's a story where the glow of kerosene lamps is matched by the shadow of monopolistic tactics, where philanthropic gifts stand next to schemes that squeezed competitors dry. To explore these buried secrets is to wrestle with the idea that real life rarely produces simple heroes or villains. The Rockefellers' tale begins far from the marble skyscrapers they would later inhabit. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in a region of upstate New York that was ablaze with religious revivals. His mother, Eliza, was a strict Baptist who taught her children to measure every action against a moral ledger. Every week the family gathered to discuss their misdeeds and to plan how to improve. She celebrated frugality. She made John wear clothes remade from his sister's dresses, and sometimes withheld gifts at Christmas to teach self-control. In that household, money wasn't used casually. It was treated almost like a sacrament, counted carefully, recorded faithfully, and tithed to the church. At the same time, John's father, William Avery Rockefeller, known by the locals as Devil Bill, lived by a very different code. He was a traveling salesman who peddled patent medicines and told elaborate stories. He would leave home for months, reappearing with thick rolls of cash. While his wife preached discipline, he bragged about cheating his own sons on small deals so they would become sharp traders. He lent John money at high interest and collected it back without warning, always reminding his son to maintain a reserve. The young John learned two lessons that seemed contradictory, one of devout thrift and one of bold opportunism. Those early experiences taught him to keep meticulous ledgers and to view each coin as a small soldier in a campaign of growth. They also taught him to mask his motives and to compartmentalize, to separate the public life from the private one, and to keep secrets when necessary. When his father was accused of a crime and fled, John buried the scandal by later referring to his mother as a widow, effectively erasing Devil Bill from the family story. The idea that you can manage contradictions by keeping separate ledgers, a moral one and a pragmatic one, became a theme of his life. John's first ventures were unglamorous. As a teenager, he worked as a bookkeeper for a produce firm and then co-founded a commission house dealing in grain and meats. In the late 1850s, as word spread of oil bubbling up in Pennsylvania, many rushed to drill wells. Rockefeller saw that refining the crude into kerosene was where the real opportunity lay. In 1870, he and a few partners created the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. They believed that efficiency and consolidation would stabilize an industry full of speculation and waste. He recognized that controlling transportation costs was crucial. In 1871, he quietly joined the South Improvement Company, an alliance that secured preferential railroad rates for member refiners. Those not in the club paid more. When news leaked, independent producers were outraged, but the deal gave Standard Oil a head start. Rockefeller approached competitors with offers to buy them out, promising cooperation and stability. He charmed them with steady profits, but also used pressure. If an owner refused to sell, there might suddenly be a shortage of barrels or a spike in the price of chemicals that the rival needed. His agents communicated in code. They called Standard Oil Club and Rockefeller Chowder to disguise their intentions. In just a few months, he acquired most of the refineries in Cleveland. With lower freight rates, he could undercut prices everywhere else. Rivals compared his strategy to an anaconda squeezing its prey. If a competitor capitulated, Rockefeller sometimes offered him a job within the growing empire, believing that absorbing talent made more sense than leaving resentment on the street. By the time he was 40, he controlled nearly 90% of refining in the United States and a large share of the pipelines and marketing. Kerosene prices fell dramatically from around 23 cents a gallon to less than 10, and consumers enjoyed cheap light. Rockefeller argued that his combination benefited the public by imposing order. Many others saw the concentration of power as a threat. These perspectives coexisted in the Rockefeller's vault. One ledger recorded efficiency and lower prices. The other kept track of coercion and secrecy. The law eventually threatened Rockefeller's ability to combine companies across state lines. In response, he and his associates devised a legal structure that became known as the trust. Shareholders in dozens of companies exchanged their stock for certificates in a single trust, run by a small group of trustees. This maneuver allowed Standard Oil to manage businesses in various states under one umbrella without technically merging them. It shielded the inner workings from public view and complicated efforts by state authorities to rein them in. In 1885, Rockefeller moved his headquarters to 26 Broadway in New York City. The granite office building looked more like a fortress than a corporate headquarters. On the 5th floor, in a suite with a private elevator, executives communicated in cipher and compiled detailed reports on every barrel shipped. While his corporate life revolved around secrecy, Rockefeller's personal life was deliberately modest. He kept his home in Cleveland relatively simple and refused to fill it with ornate decorations. He insisted that his children wear plain clothes and perform household chores. They mended furniture and recorded every penny in their ledgers. He would sometimes lead them on bicycle chases around their estate, tying a white cloth to his waist as they tried to catch him. These games revealed a playful side that the public never saw. Yet even in these moments, the lessons of diligence and frugality were embedded. He wanted to insulate his family from the ostentatious habits of the Gilded Age, to shield them from the corrupting influence of easy wealth. The house and the office were connected by the same principle. Discipline protects what the vault contains. As his influence grew, so did public animosity. Reporters drew Rockefeller as an octopus whose tentacles reached across railroads, pipelines, and politics. Ida Tarbell's investigations in magazines exposed the preferential freight agreements and the secret deals used to crush rivals. Populist politicians promised to dismantle Standard Oil, and cartoons depicted the company strangling the American economy. At John Jr.'s wedding to Abby Aldrich, Pinkerton guards patrolled the grounds, and guests arrived by yacht to avoid protesters. Bomb threats and kidnapping plots became part of daily life. Despite constant criticism, Rockefeller rarely defended himself publicly. He preferred to let his business speak for itself, and he sought solace in his faith. Ever the Baptist, he continued to tithe, to attend church, and to remind himself of the preacher's words. Make as much money as you can, and then give away as much as you can. Philanthropy became the second ledger in Rockefeller's life. From his earliest wages, he set aside funds for the church and for charities. As his fortune grew, so did his giving. He funded the University of Chicago, which quickly became a leading institution. He endowed medical research at what became the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. He and his wife, Laura Spellman Rockefeller, established the General Education Board to support schools in the American South, including African American institutions during the era of Jim Crow. They did not simply write checks. They insisted on meticulous reporting and measurable results. In 1913, even before the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil, Rockefeller endowed the Rockefeller Foundation with an unprecedented sum. Its charter was broad: to promote the well-being of mankind. Through this foundation, he hoped to channel industrial wealth into public good. The Rockefeller Foundation quickly became a powerhouse in public health and education. One of its first initiatives targeted hookworm disease in the American South. At the time, hookworm was nicknamed the germ of laziness because it caused anemia and fatigue. Many plantation owners dismissed it as a moral failing among sharecroppers. The foundation instead dispatched doctors and nurses who educated rural communities about sanitation, built latrines, and administered treatment. The program dramatically reduced infection rates and improved productivity, illustrating how a targeted intervention could transform public health. The Foundation's International Health Division expanded these campaigns globally, tackling yellow fever in Latin America and West Africa, supporting the development of vaccines, and training local health workers. In education, the Foundation funded public health schools at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, and underwrote research in social sciences, agriculture, and the arts. Grants from the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial created social work departments and paid for studies into income distribution and unemployment. These philanthropic endeavors, recorded in the Vault's public ledger, reshaped fields ranging from medical research to economics. The Foundation's involvement in public health sometimes intersected with international diplomacy. Its efforts to control malaria in Italy after World War I involved collaboration with the League of Nations and the Italian government. In China, the Foundation supported the China Medical Board, which established the Peking Union Medical College, providing modern medical education to Chinese students and training nurses and midwives. These programs were not purely benevolent. They also served to extend American influence and to create networks of professionals aligned with Western scientific methods. The Foundation supported agricultural research in Mexico that later contributed to the Green Revolution, helping to develop high-yield varieties of wheat and maize that would feed millions. It sponsored conferences on nutrition, statistics, and economics, seeding academic disciplines that endure today. These initiatives illustrate how the Rockefellers' philanthropic machinery operated at the intersection of science, policy, and soft power, blending humanitarian aims with strategic considerations. Yet even as the Rockefellers gave generously, some of their programs ventured into morally ambiguous territory. In the early 20th century, eugenics was considered cutting-edge science by many elites. The movement claimed that selective breeding could improve humanity by reducing so-called undesirable traits. Influenced by this thinking, the Rockefeller Foundation's Division of Medical Sciences funded research on human heredity, intelligence testing, and reproductive biology that overlapped with eugenic philosophies. It supported projects at American universities that promoted racial hygiene and financed the Eugenics Record Office, which collected pedigrees and advocated for sterilization. It also made large grants to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Germany. Scientists like Ernst Rudin and Ottmar von Verschuer received Rockefeller money well into the 1930s, even after the Nazi regime had enacted racial laws. The foundation also supported prominent birth control advocates, such as Margaret Sanger, whose views sometimes incorporated eugenic ideas. Looking back, Historians note that these grants lent credibility to a movement that justified forced sterilization, segregation, and ultimately genocide. Rockefeller executives later claimed they were supporting legitimate science and were unaware of the darker implications. But the records show that funding continued even as discriminatory policies escalated. It wasn't until after World War II, when the full horrors of Nazi racial ideology came to light, that the foundation reevaluated its support and publicly distanced itself. The family has since acknowledged that some of its philanthropic decisions had harmful outcomes. In this area of the vault, the ledger records both an earnest desire to advance science and a failure to recognize the human cost of certain scientific agendas. Ethical lapses extended beyond eugenics. The Foundation's involvement in public health sometimes intersected with questionable experiments. In the 1940s, U.S. government researchers conducted syphilis experiments in Guatemala that infected hundreds of people without their consent. Decades later, a lawsuit argued that the Rockefeller Foundation bore responsibility because its scientists collaborated on related research. In Tennessee, a project funded through Vanderbilt University gave radioactive iron to pregnant women without informing them of the risks, leading to serious health consequences for their babies. In Puerto Rico, a foundation-funded scientist wrote about injecting cancer cells into patients, revealing prejudiced attitudes. These episodes, now widely criticized, show how philanthropic ambition can stray into human experimentation when oversight fails. The vault holds reports celebrating successes and, tucked away, documents revealing missteps and harms. While philanthropy occupied much of John D Rockefeller's later years, legal and political pressures eventually forced changes in his business empire. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil violated antitrust laws and ordered the trust dissolved into more than 30 companies. The decision marked a turning point in American attitudes toward monopolies. When a friend told him the news on a golf course, Rockefeller reportedly responded calmly and even joked that the breakup would make him richer. He was right. The value of the separate companies, including familiar names like Exxon, Chevron, and Mobil, increased significantly. Rockefeller's share of each ensured that his wealth continued to grow. The ruling symbolized the closing of one chapter in the vault, the era of unregulated industrial consolidation. But it opened another, in which diversified holdings and philanthropic organizations became the main instruments of influence. No episode tested the Rockefellers' moral claims more dramatically than the labor conflict at Ludlow, Colorado. In 1913, miners working for Colorado Fuel and Iron, a company controlled by the family, went on strike. They demanded safer conditions, fair wages, and the right to unionize. The workforce included immigrants from dozens of countries. The company responded by evicting strikers from company housing, forcing families into tent colonies. Winter came and tensions rose. The management hired armed guards. Local law enforcement deputized strikebreakers. Labor organizer Mother Jones traveled to Colorado to support the miners, and a march of children carrying banners that read, "We want bread and roses too," drew national sympathy. John D Rockefeller Jr., who had taken over day-to-day management from his father, testified before Congress that he trusted his managers and knew little of the situation. His father rewarded him with shares in the company, perceiving loyalty as paramount. Tragedy struck on April 20th, 1914, when the Colorado National Guard and company guards attacked the tent colony at Ludlow. Machine guns sprayed bullets. Tents caught fire. As the camp burned, women and children hiding in trenches suffocated. At least 24 people died, including 11 children. Newspapers called it the Ludlow Massacre. Angry protesters denounced the Rockefellers as murderers. Mobs gathered outside their offices. Radicals plotted attacks. A bomb intended for John Jr. exploded prematurely in a New York tenement, killing the conspirators. The family was shaken. Jr. initially defended the company's actions, but public condemnation forced him to reconsider. On advice from future Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and others, he traveled to Colorado to meet with miners. He shook hands with Mother Jones, sat in union halls and promised reforms. He allowed workers to form grievance committees and created recreational facilities. These measures did not undo the tragedy, but did mark a shift. The Ludlow Massacre taught John Jr. that no amount of charity could erase the stain of workers' blood, and that direct engagement with labor was necessary. It remains a powerful reminder that wealth created at workers' expense cannot be redeemed solely by donations. The family's reputation now had a bloodstain recorded in the vault. As the Rockefellers entered the 20th century, the family grew and diversified. John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his wife Abby raised 6 children, a daughter, Abby Babs Rockefeller, and 5 sons, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David. From an early age, the children were told that wealth was a tool for service, and that their lives should balance privilege with responsibility. They were given allowances and required to account for every expense in small black books. They mended their own clothes and performed chores. Yet they also enjoyed the privileges of their station: private tutors, art lessons, and summers at the Hudson River estate called Kykwit. Their father continued his quiet but firm guidance. After the trauma of Ludlow, he poured his energies into philanthropy, urban planning, and culture. John III became a leading supporter of international organizations. He helped create the Asia Society and chaired the Council on Economic and Cultural Affairs. His passion for Asian art and culture led him to fund museums and educational programs. Nelson Rockefeller pursued politics. After serving as coordinator of the Office of Inter-American Affairs during World War II, he became governor of New York and eventually Vice President of the United States under Gerald Ford. Nelson was known for his ambitious public works projects, including the Empire State Plaza in Albany, and his moderate Republican views. Lawrence Rockefeller championed conservation. He used his personal fortune to buy and preserve wilderness areas, contributing to national parks in places like Wyoming and the Virgin Islands. Winthrop Rockefeller moved to Arkansas, where he sought to bring progressive business practices and later served as the state's governor. David Rockefeller, the youngest, pursued finance. He became president and later chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, expanding its international presence. He also chaired the Council on Foreign Relations and founded the Trilateral Commission with scholar Zbigniew Brzezinski to foster cooperation among North America Western Europe, and Japan. David's life illustrated the family's blending of business, politics, and diplomacy. Behind the scenes, the brothers met regularly in a Manhattan office known as Room 5600. This suite, perched high above the city, served as both family council chamber and control room for their many ventures. They discussed philanthropic initiatives, business investments, and political strategies. They agreed on certain principles, such as maintaining the family's legacy of giving, but they also recognized each other's autonomy. Their meetings were private, and notes were often sealed for decades. The vault of secrecy persisted into the next generation. Each brother pursued his own passions, but they remained united in their commitment to philanthropy and in their efforts to protect the family's reputation from scandal. Room 5600 symbolized the balancing act they performed, cooperating without forcing uniformity, preserving wealth while claiming to serve public interests. If the early Rockefellers' wealth came from controlling oil, the later generations leveraged that wealth into influence across many fields. They used their endowments to shape education, the arts, and environmental policy. They were instrumental in building Rockefeller Center, a complex in Midtown Manhattan that combined commercial and cultural space. They supported the construction of the Museum of Modern Art, where Abby Rockefeller's personal interest in modern art played a decisive role. Through the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and other foundations, they funded civil rights projects, environmental studies, and international education. The brothers often responded to public concerns. After World War II, they backed efforts to rebuild Europe. During the Cold War, they funded programs aimed at understanding and countering Soviet influence. In the 1960s, they supported environmental research, anticipating concerns about pollution and conservation. Their philanthropic vision had broadened from the specific goals of their father to a global perspective. But controversies continued. In the 1970s and 1980s, as environmentalism gained momentum, activists criticized the family for profiting from fossil fuels while funding conservation. Some called for divestment from oil companies. The family's involvement in finance, particularly through Chase Manhattan Bank, led to scrutiny of connections to political regimes and the CIA. During David Rockefeller's tenure, the bank cultivated relationships with governments around the world, sometimes in countries with questionable human rights records. David's personal friendships with leaders like Henry Kissinger and his role in organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations fueled conspiracy theories about global elites. Critics accused the Trilateral Commission of promoting secret agendas. For David, these connections were about diplomacy and economic cooperation. For skeptics, they were evidence of a shadowy global network. Tensions between profit and ethics resurfaced in modern times. In the 21st century, some of John D Rockefeller's descendants publicly urged divestment from fossil fuels as part of a broader fight against climate change. They argued that the oil industry's contribution to global warming contradicted the family's philanthropic commitments to public health and the environment. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund announced plans to divest from coal and tar sands and to reinvest in renewable energy. This marked a symbolic break with the source of their wealth. Meanwhile, other branches of the family continued to hold shares in oil companies illustrating the ongoing challenge of reconciling heritage with evolving values. Humanizing the Rockefellers means recognizing that behind the name and the numbers were people wrestling with their own times. John D Rockefeller was a father who played games with his children and who quietly prayed. A businessman who believed in efficiency and who also conspired to crush competitors. A philanthropist whose gifts transformed medicine and whose endowment funded questionable science. John Jr. learned humility in the face of public outrage at Ludlow. The third and fourth generations navigated politics, diplomacy, conservation, and finance, often with genuine ideals, yet always in the shadow of their family's history. Each decision to fund a hospital or a museum, each handshake with a world leader, each investment in a new technology, added another entry to the vault, sometimes in the ledger of hope, sometimes in the ledger of caution. This story invites us to question simple narratives of heroes and villains. The Rockefellers lit lamps around the world, built universities, and preserved national parks. They also throttled competition, supported scientists whose work fed racist ideologies, and benefited from an economic system that often exploited labor. Their philanthropy did not erase their misdeeds, but it did deliver tangible benefits to millions of people. The contradictions persist because human beings are rarely consistent. Our public actions and private motives often diverge. The Rockefellers' vault, both literal and metaphorical, remains locked away in the imagination of many, not to hide secrets, but to remind us that understanding the past requires confronting complexity. When we peer into that vault, we see that oil, blood, and buried secrets are part of a single tapestry that still shapes our world.